I always told myself that if I ever became a teacher, I would at least make some mention of these three conferences. They were often neglected because these conferences were a big loss for the United States, and maybe that's why. Three of them at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. The one thing you want to remember about them is the Soviet Union was given Eastern Europe. Now, this is not as important as it once was because by 1990, the Soviet Union had lost Eastern Europe. But Eastern Europe fell under communism. Stalin promised that these areas would have free elections. Stalin claimed that the Soviet Union needed this area to protect it from a future war with Germany, a war that has never happened. Keep in mind now, Stalin had fought two world wars, both against Germany. Russia had fought Germany in World War I, and then the Soviet Union fought in World War II. And Stalin used that as an excuse to take over Eastern Europe. But essentially, Eastern Europe was given to the Soviet Union, and Stalin made a promise for free elections, a promise that he broke. In addition to that, Stalin promised that they would back Chiang Kai-shek in China, another promise that Stalin broke. Now, I'm going to have more to say about Stalin when we come to the next chapter.
It was the free election, what was the other thing?
The Eastern Europe, no, I'm talking about the Eastern Europe, I'm talking about Romania, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Albania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, those countries in Eastern Europe that were under communism during all my young manhood. In other words, when it fell under communism in 1945, we remained under communism for 45 years until 1990 when they all broke loose. But these places were given as a result of these three conferences. Tehran is in Iran, Yalta was in the Soviet Union, and Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin, the three of them met to discuss post-war Europe, and it turned out to be a disaster. Now, at the Yalta Conference occurred in February 1945. Roosevelt was a very, very, very sick man. And if you look at his pictures, I showed a very famous picture of Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt. Roosevelt was very sick, and he died in April. And that might have had something to do with it. Otherwise, Roosevelt has been accused of dancing with the devil.
But my question was, besides the free election, what else did Stalin?
Oh, he promised that Russia would support. China was fighting a civil war with Mao Zedong on the one side, the communists, and Chiang Kai-shek on the other. And Stalin promised he would support Chiang Kai-shek. He broke the promise and supported Mao Zedong instead, with the result that Mao Zedong won. And in 1949, the communists took over China. And the communists have had China from that day till this. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I do want to mention Japanese internment. During World War II, the United States rounded up all the Japanese and put them in camps, surrounded by high barbed wire fences. This act, folk, today it's soundly condemned. But at the time, all right, in 1942 when it was done, nobody alive in the United States in 1942 said a word against the act. It was just like everybody knew. Now, some people who felt sorry for them would give these Japanese warm coats and warm blankets in the wintertime. Some of them gave them food. They were fed. Now, they were fed American food, though, which was not what they would have preferred to eat. But unlike the Holocaust victims in Germany and Poland, these people were fed. Now, again, we can condemn the action, but at the time, nobody did. It was war. Now, you can say, and everybody has said that, well, there's no evidence that Japanese were planning to hurt the United States in any way. I'm talking about the Japanese in America. You can say that that's true folk. On the other hand, the Japanese had proved to be highly unpredictable. From time to time you'll hear about this. It's looked on as being a disgraceful act. If you haven't guessed already, I personally think that it's war, and it's the way war has to be done. War, folk, is awful, terrible, horrible, and it forces you to do things that you don't want to do and that you'll regret the rest of your life. Now, on D-Day, that was the day that the United States crossed the United States, Britain, and Canada crossed the English Channel and went into France. The English Channel was very narrow, but we crossed the English Channel into France, and we had opened up the second front that Stalin always wanted us to open up. This was on June 6, 1944, and if you're paying attention, on every June 6th, you'll hear something about it, especially a year that ends in 4. So in 1994 or 1964, they talked about it, 74, 1984, 1994, 2004, 2014. They always mention D-Day. Most of the men who participated are now deceased. My wife's father was on D-Day +2. In other words, he arrived on June 8th, 1944, 2 days after the initial landing. But we've landed in France. The Germans did not react to us decisively. Part of the reason was the Germans had to take a lot of their men who were protecting France and put them fighting the Russians who were coming in from the east. So Germany was fighting a two-front war, fighting the Russians on the east and the United States and Great Britain and Canada on the west. All right, I'm going to rush through this because I'm behind already. Oh yes, one thing I want to mention, folk. We began bombing raids on Germany. The bombing raids were extremely dangerous. The two most used bombers were the B-24 and B-17. Now, on a personal note, my father's brother, my uncle, was involved in a bombing raid. His airplane took off one day on a mission and was never seen or heard from again. They are finding World War II airplanes and ships all the time. And if they ever find his plane, they'll come looking for me. I'm his nearest living relative. But anyway, he disappeared along with everyone in his crew. There were 13 men on the plane. None of them ever heard from again.
What do you think happened?
He was bombing Austria. He started in Italy, went up the Adriatic Sea, and officially the government had to put down something so that this family could collect insurance, these families of these men. So officially the government said, we think his plane fell into the Adriatic Sea on its way north. But once his plane took off in the clouds, November 15th, 1944. Plane took off, disappeared in the clouds, no radio contact. A lot of the men who came back reported lightning in the area, might have been hit by lightning. Now, these men who took part in the bombing missions were told, if you can survive 25 missions, you get to go home. For you, the war will be over. Very, very few men survived the 25 missions. Just a few. It was so dangerous. You'd be flying along, and all of a sudden, as you got over into each other, you'd hear what we call flak. Flak was when an enemy bullet was hitting your plane. You just hoped the bullet did not hit the fuel tank or some vital wire on the plane that would destroy the plane. But a lot of times it did. But you'd hear the bullets hitting, and all you could do was hope it didn't hit you. And you had a thin piece of metal between you and... Of course, by the time those bullets got that high, they were not as powerful. And most of them didn't penetrate the aluminum skin of the plane. But some of them did. And many a plane was brought down, many a bombing mission. But we sent bombing missions into Germany. Now, your book tries to downplay the missions that they were not effective, but folk, at the end, it was a bombing mission that finally ended World War II, which I'll talk about in a minute. Germany surrendered first, but before Germany surrendered, Roosevelt died. Hitler was overjoyed. Roosevelt died in April 1945, and you may know Hitler's birthday was April 20th. Roosevelt had died before then in 1945. Roosevelt thought, the United States will fall apart. He was wrong. The United States is governed by a constitution, not by a person. Roosevelt had been president for a long time, but he passed on. And Harry Truman became the president. And he carried on the war, and the war went on running fairly smoothly. Now, shortly after Germany was really being hemmed in from the east, the Russians were pouring in, the United States decided to stop advancing because the United States was afraid that one of our contingents might run into a Russian contingent and the two sides start shooting at each other. So they told Stalin, have your men not come to a certain point. We're going to stop at this certain point and not advance. That explains, folks, why the Russians got to Berlin. It was a big risk. Also, one of the officers said, if we try to go assault Berlin, it costs us 100,000 American lives. A lot of persons decided this was not that important, and we ran the risk of bumping into a Russian contingent. So we stopped. The Russians went in and took over East Germany, including the city of Berlin. Keep this in mind because this is going to explain why a lot of what happened after the war. The Berlin issue used to be a big issue during the time I was a young man. Well, finally, Hitler disappeared. Now, officially, folk, Hitler committed suicide. There are rumors that he made it out of Germany alive and went to Latin America. And actually, we've learned that the CIA actually went into Mexico once to look for him. But be that as it may, officially he committed suicide, and officially the Russians found him, the Soviets found him, and they exhumed and reburied his body. The Russians claim they have his body, but the rest of the world has never seen it. Something that's highly suspicious, folk. Everyone on Hitler's staff told the same story. Now, when your leader dies and everyone tells the same story, you've got to be suspicious. Because normally, when something big happens, everybody's going to tell a slightly different story. In this case, the leader died, and everybody told the same story, which almost makes it seem like the story was corroborated. Hitler had supposedly committed suicide. He had married his live-in girlfriend who he lived with for many years. He married her a few hours before he died. Then they both committed suicide, and both were buried. Bodies of neither one has ever been found.
It
Yes.
was actually her niece. It was his niece.
What's that?
It's his niece, or it was his niece.
Say that again.
The girlfriend was the niece.
Isn't it? Oh, okay. Now you're getting your story slightly mixed up, I think. He fell madly in love with his niece when he was a young man, before he got to be Führer. He fell madly in love with her. He was 38 and she was only 19. And she committed suicide, and he almost did himself. He was really torn up about it. I believe that's a different story. Now, Eva Braun was not his niece. Eva Braun was the wife that he married. Now, again, you might have heard it was his niece, but he did fall madly in love with one of his nieces one time. Again, it shows you the man was a nutcase. If it's wrong to call anyone a nutcase, I mean, it's a word I don't normally use, but he had quite a bit that was wrong with him. All right. Now that we've celebrated VE Day, the Victory in Europe Day. I'm not going to write that down, but we celebrated VE Day for a time. But VE Day celebration was extreme because we still had to fight Japan. The Japanese resorted to suicide missions, kamikaze. Kamikaze, where that they'd send their airplanes straight into American ships. Most of the kamikaze missions were not successful. We later learned that those planes were hard to steer, but nobody who ever went on one ever came back. Now, also, the men who took part in those missions were heavily sedated and drunk and could not fly straight. If they'd have been driving on a road, they'd probably killed themselves and somebody else, but they were heavily sedated. But they would just come right in, and the American gunners on the ships couldn't figure, what's going on, what's going on? And they found out, hey, these men are trying to ram a ship. Most of the planes fell harmlessly into the sea. Again, hard to steer and highly intoxicated, highly drugged pilots flying them. But this was Japan's last desperate weapon. The United States began dropping several bombs and Japan wouldn't surrender. Then finally, we dropped 2 bombs on 2 Japanese cities, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Folk, I had a student tell me that the dropping of the bombs was immoral. Maybe you think so. What you have to understand again is these men had fought 2 world wars. Personally, I never fought any. World War II ended 4 years before I was born. What's it like to have fought 2 world wars, and we had to make sure that Germany and Japan did not rise up again. So we occupied both countries, and we still have troops in Germany and Japan. We had to tell the Japanese, you have to surrender unconditionally. The Japanese refused. If we had not dropped those bombs, it would have cost the lives of 2 million men, 1 million American servicemen at least, and 1 million Japanese servicemen and civilians. We dropped the bombs, killed 70,000 in Nagasaki, about 70,000 more in Hiroshima. Someone asked, why didn't we just drop the bombs on an uninhabited area, just to show the Japanese that we could? What we didn't tell the Japanese, this was a super kept secret, was we only had 2 of them. It would be months before we could build more. We only had 2 bombs, and we had to make them count. We dropped one, the Japanese still didn't surrender. We dropped the second one, and this time the Japanese surrendered. If they would have known that we didn't have any more, they didn't know that. Again, was it the right thing to do? It saved the lives of at least 2 million men on both sides, 1 million on each side. I went to a church camp one time where my counselor had been in Okinawa, which is the island closest to Japan, and he knew if he had had to invade Japan, he'd have been killed. Purely and simply. In Okinawa, they had a 100%, the Japanese fought desperately in Okinawa. Every American who was sent to Okinawa was either killed or wounded. So my counselor was there in the second wave. You know, he was a replacement soldier. Came in late in the war, was sent to Okinawa. He fought for a few days, and then Japan, the Japanese surrendered. Atomic bombs is the only time in history atomic bombs have been used in warfare. The president who ordered them was President Harry Truman. All right. With that, we celebrated victory, and the war was over. All right. Which takes us up now to chapter...
Wait, we are on chapter 25.
I'm now going to be on chapter 26. Yeah, chapter 25. I just finished. I didn't finish chapter 25, but I decided I was going to rush through it. So now it's beginning chapter 26. The war is over. The troops are coming home. A lot of persons expected that the Great Depression that we'd experienced before the war would continue because we had several million American servicemen coming home who would want jobs. But instead, Congress passed the GI Bill, or Congress had already passed the GI Bill, and that meant that a lot of these men could get free college and had delayed going into the workforce. That GI Bill is still in the books, and a lot of young men today are in college because of the GI Bill. The GI Bill, you can join the Army for 4 years. I think now they have you have an 8-year obligation. But you can join the Army. When you get out, you can go to college. And in a lot of cases, you can join ROTC, and the government will pay for your college. And you come out as a commissioned officer, come out as a graduate as a second lieutenant. It isn't easy, but it can be done. But also, the United States, unlike what happened after World War I, the United States directed the peace talks. The United States emerged as the most powerful nation in the world. The United States had an economic monopoly and a nuclear monopoly. So the United States began giving money to assist the countries that had been torn by the war. We gave aid to Greece and Turkey. Greece had been devastated by the war. We also gave aid to our former enemies, Italy and Germany. Stalin was very upset because we didn't give aid to them, and folk, I want you to keep in mind, we had given tons and tons of equipment to the Soviet Union in order to help them fight Hitler, which they never paid us back for. But we didn't give them aid when the war was over. Now, folk, I want to give a little speech about what it's like to be friends with a man named Stalin. I'm not knocking Roosevelt and Truman for trying to be friends with the man. I mean, the man was on our side. You understand? Sometimes in real life, you are forced into a working relationship with a man who's an utter louse. This was what happened in World War II when we were forced into Stalin's camp. Circumstances. In other words, Stalin wound up on our side because Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union came on our side. But what's it like to be friends with Stalin? Well, number one, he's always complaining that you're not doing enough. We're fighting the bulk of the war, and you people have not opened up a second front. And then he was upset because we were so slow at opening up the second. Well, actually, we were. We were fighting him in Africa, the Germans in Africa. Then we fought the Germans in Italy. Then finally, we opened up the front in France. He wanted us to open up. But he's a person like that. He was always complaining. In addition, he made promises, like what I mentioned, that he did not keep. Then, and here's the catch-22 about being in a friendship with a man like Stalin. We reminded him, hey, you promised free elections in those countries in Eastern Europe, and Stalin came back. But you people are supporting dictatorships in Latin America. You are supporting dictatorships in your own hemisphere. Why are you so upset when we're supporting communist dictatorships on our side of the world? And again, folk, people like that will blame you and find something that you're doing that's a fault. One thing after another, eventually, when the war ended, the Soviet Union and the United States split. And what was the result was a Cold War. It's called the Cold War. The Cold War was destined to last 45 years, from 1945 to 1990. And much of my youth and manhood, young manhood, was spent with our country involved in a Cold War, which a couple of times got involved in a shooting war, namely Korea and Vietnam. But also in the case of Stalin, every time there was a crisis, he was on the opposite side of the crisis from you. Now, if you have not bumped into a person like Stalin yet in your lifetime, you will. I dated a girl one time I thought was a pretty nice girl. I mean, maybe I shouldn't be on this personal stuff. Turned out, I believe, she was alcoholic and suicidal. If you were to meet her, she could tell you all kinds of bad things about me, yes. Because people like that are always finding fault with you. And some of the things she might say might actually contain some truth. A lot of it would be just pure raw fabrication. But you get two unequal people together, the one who's most unequal is going to criticize the one who's higher up. Stalin and Roosevelt, Stalin and Truman were unequal morally. The United States and Russia, the Soviet were unequal morally. And Stalin criticized our side more than we criticized theirs. All right, now chapter 26. Your book opens up with a vignette about Helen Douglas. Helen Douglas, the women had had the right to serve in Congress since 1919, but very few did. But this one did. She had wanted us to cooperate with the Soviet Union. She had ties to liberal organizations. So in 1950, she ran against Richard Milhouse Nixon. And anyone who knows anything much about when Richard Nixon was a dirty campaigner. He was a dirty player. He called her communist up one side and down the other. He had done the same thing in 1948 when he first ran for Congress against another woman named Voorhis. And in later years said, I knew all along she was not a communist, but hey, I had an election to win. Just accuse your opponent of anything just to make sure he got elected. But anyway, he accused her of being communist, and she lost the election. All right. Want to pause here. Rather than take time to call roll, just each of you circle your picture and pass it on. And if you don't see your picture there, write your name in. All right. Now, the Cold War got started largely because of our disagreements with Eastern Europe. As I mentioned, the Soviet Union took over Eastern Europe and forced millions of people under communism, and this got the Cold War started. Harry Truman he had dealt with domestic issues, but had very little experience in foreign affairs. And this might have hurt the country somewhat. Harry Truman had gotten himself elected president. Well, he never was. He got himself elected vice president because the men Roosevelt really wanted to pick were men whom the country had turned against, and Roosevelt needed someone whom the people would like. Harry Truman was such a man, so Harry Truman became the president. Now, the United States knew that the German people could become industrialized. They wanted Germany to industrialize. But here is the problem with Germany now. All right, I'm going to draw a crude map here. Germany was divided into 4 spheres. The United States got one. Great Britain got one. I'll call it the UK, United Kingdom. France got a plate, and the USSR. 4 areas. Right in the middle of the Soviet Unions was the city of Berlin. Berlin also was divided, with the United States getting a place, France getting one, the UK getting one, and the USSR getting another. You might have noticed Berlin is inside the Soviet Union's area. Well, the United States wanted Germany to industrialize. The Soviet Union did not. So the United States and Britain and France got together and they formed West Germany. The Soviet Union then formed East Germany. And Berlin also became divided with East Berlin and West Berlin. Well, Stalin got the brilliant idea one day that, hey, I can blockade Berlin and starve the Berliners out. So he would not allow any trains and trucks to come in. Okay. The person that just walked in, will you please circle this? Everybody just circle their picture, I suppose. Here, there it goes. All right. The result was Harry Truman and the new Prime Minister of Britain decided that they would airlift aid to Berlin. And this was known as the Berlin Airlift. Winston Churchill, who'd been deposed as Prime Minister at this point, again, I don't quite know why, but he went to the United States, and at one point when he was speaking to a group of colleagues, he said, an iron curtain has descended over Europe. And the term Iron Curtain was to last for another 45 years. The word Iron Curtain simply meant these countries under communism. Iron Curtain countries, of course, included the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, and then the Eastern European countries. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Albania, Romania,